It's on now. Okay. Hello. Hello. Thank you everyone for coming. So this is our talk today. I'm going to the talk I'm talking about common through patterns and how to structure a funny video game. So before we get started, it's a little bit of introduction. Hello. My name is Tanat. I'm from Thailand. Did a bachelor in game dev. Did not get a game job. And now I'm the dev behind building relationships. So if you haven't checked out building relationships or don't know what it's about, here's a very quick look at it. It's my first game. It was announced last year at Summer Game Fest, and hopefully it's coming out this year. So here's a quick look. So that's the game. So there's also audio. I don't know if there's audio coming out of the that side of the presentation, but let's keep going. All right. So what's about my comedy experience? So let's take a quick look at in terms of comedy. So you could say I'm a bit of a writer. I'm quite familiar with writing. I consume a little bit of writing. And if you don't know this app, I wish I were you. But enough about hobbies. Let's talk about something more professional. So I started my career on Stadia. So you don't know what Stadia is, or rather, what Stadia was. You don't need to worry about it because it was this cloud gaming thing at Google. But you know, the company started laying off people. Didn't quite enjoy my time there, so I decided, you know what? It's time to switch careers, and I went from burning out in tech to switching into games, which is the true clown career path. All right, so what will we cover today? So the talk, we'll look at the title of the talk, Comedy Through Patterns, what that means exactly. We'll be looking to further expand on that. We'll be looking through comedy fundamentals, looking at humor beyond just joke writing, and see how that manifests in different parts of games, different disciplines. And we'll be going through case studies. We'll be going through a lot of games and seeing how it manifests differently in different games. Don't worry about my secret agenda. Don't worry about that. And then we'll look at one final scene from the game. Cool. So disclaimer. This talk will not teach you to be funny. I'm sorry. It's not something that can be taught. It's like a craft that you refine over time and you kind of find on your own. So instead, this talk will focus on the structure. We'll be looking at what supports comedy, what helps land a joke. And it's kind of like if you know someone who's like a funny person in their friend group, and then they try out stand-up comedy at an open mic, and they end up bombing. This talk hopefully will tell you why exactly they bombed. So yeah, let's get started. So kind of like the main theme of this talk, something to kind of keep in mind as you go, is we'll be looking at comedy through patterns. We'll be looking at it as we'll look at humor, kind of summarized as establishing patterns, we're playing with patterns, and then disrupting those patterns later on. This is kind of like a very brief and loose definition of everything, but it is something that can help structure our train of thought and help structure how we view the rest of the talk, basically. Cool. So let's explore what this means. We'll get started by looking at some comedy fundamentals. So number one, setup and payoff. This is kind of like our building block. It is what it sounds like. The setup sets something up. It establishes context. It's usually concise. It's usually precise, but it's engaging. There's sometimes a good narrative flow to help you understand what the situation is. And then there's a payoff. And the payoff is kind of like the punchline. Think of it as the joke, what you traditionally think of as the joke in a set. That is our payoff. It plays with what context we established earlier. And there's lots of different ways to do payoffs. There are twists. There's sometimes something absurd that just randomly happens, something unexpected. And pretty much everything in comedy is setup and payoffs. It is, when you look at comedy as a whole, it is structured with just setups and payoffs. So once you kind of understand this, you kind of get a good understanding of everything. So let's think further to this. Let's talk about an example. So this is a scene from the game. So the game, you play as a house, you meet other buildings. And here we'll be taking a good look at Millie, which is one of the characters you can date in the game. And the topic of conversation right now, Millie's talking about fishing. So, the next kind of line of dialogue, Millie's like, actually, I'm vegetarian, switched to only eating furniture last year. And that's kind of the flow of this dialogue is it takes the advantage of cultural context. You talk about like diet culture. Gives a hint of who Millie is as a character. It separates the text box, in terms of which one is set up, which one is a punchline. And I play with the camera cuts, different camera angles to help guide the player towards, hey, this is a joke. Just to kind of like make it a little bit more obvious to the players. Overall, there's a kind of a flow of the dialogue, right? It starts about talking about fishing, how to be a vegetarian. I was like, wait a minute, what does it mean for a building to be vegetarian? And then before you kind of like have the time to digest that question, it comes in, it's like, hey, I'm only eating furniture. Cool. Amazing. All right. So let's look at other ways to play around with this kind of pattern. And the next topic we'll talk about is timing and delivery. It's kind of like playing around with subtle yet recognizable norms. A lot of times you'll see this in like physical comics will play around with this a lot. The physicality of how to tell a story, and it's expression, emotions. They all help like frame the situation, help like players, viewers understand the context a little bit better. So we'll go back to the comment from Millie. Millie's my favorite character, so a lot of this talk is about her or about them. So within the same introduction beat, this is another piece of dialogue from the game. And it's a quick video, so watch this together. And we're going to be clicking on the second option here. Millie's asking about, or Millie's like, asking what have you been up to, basically. We're clicking at number 2. I love it when people are too uncomfortable to laugh. So just to kind of break down the scene a little bit more, there's a lot of me playing around with how the camera moves. There within the game, a lot of dialogue. It has specific ways of how there's a default way the camera moves, and then you spice up a little bit when it matches the scene, matches the vibe. Helps create something unexpected, something that kind of comes out of nowhere, but it kind of lands. And the emotion kind of is, there's some emotion to be felt even if the characters don't have any sort of expression to them. A lot of it comes from the camera angle, the short dialogue that helps align the focus, nothing too flowery to help pull the focus into the mood that I'm trying to set within the dialogue. So yeah. As we play around these patterns, sometimes they get a little bit predictable. The more you repeat them, the more you play with certain same things over and over. So the next topic is disruption. We'll be disrupting our own patterns we've built over time. So it's kind of like a twist of what we've established. Usually you sprinkle some hints early on, and then bam, it's something unexpected, but not entirely random. It should make some sort of sense, Random is okay, but the more random it becomes, it's hard to kind of follow along, and you will lose some audience that way. So it tends to rely on pre-established context instead. So look at some examples from the game. You know how every video game has a fishing mini game. On Twitter back in the day, people say like, "Oh, this game is," the game has a fishing mini game. So in the game, there is a fishing mini game, but instead of fishing up for fish, it's absurd for a house to fish up fish. Like that doesn't make sense. So instead, you fish up cars because I think that made way more sense. The setup here is kind of like the genre expectations we play around with. Like it's cultural in terms of for gamers kind of expect. It's cultural for gamers who fish in a way that's not hard. So not like in real life. It kind of makes sense for a house because like a car is kind of going to a garage. that it makes sense that relationship that way, right? It's closer for, like, there's a closer relationship between cars and house compared to a house and fish. But now we'll kind of talk about all of these different points. Let's bring it all together with our fourth point, which is the rule of thirds. You probably have heard the line, like, comedy comes in threes. And that doesn't necessarily mean that, like, it takes three of something to it takes three of something to be funny. But it's kind of because three of something makes a pattern. Rule of thirds can look like a series of punchlines, one that sets up the next, and that way there's kind of like an evolution, like the joke keeps evolving. Or sometimes, the first two jokes kind of set things in a certain direction, and the third one comes in that kind of changes the whole trajectory of the comedy set, basically. So, to kind of talk about this further, let's go back and revisit some of the points we made earlier, right? The first part we talked about Millie's, furniture diet. Later on in the game, you play a mini game where you build furniture, like in IKEA. So there's like an IKEA manual to the side, and this is like a picnic day, and you're making like a sandwich. But instead of making a sandwich, this makes sense for a house to eat a sandwich. So instead, you're building an IKEA table for them. And yeah, just normal things. Remember the fishing mini game. There's lots of different types of fish, and they play around with kind of like the gameplay kind of changes in subtle ways for some of them. Specifically, these racing car. Race cars are very fast, and they can break out of the UI. So the fish kind of just exit the UI just because I think it makes sense. So that is the point I'm trying to establish here, is that, like, the bits in that the jokes should develop a couple of times. It should evolve without, like, tiring the audience, in a way that's like it's delightful, unexpected. Whichever direction you take, it should evolve, and however it makes sense to you, basically. This kind of remind us of the point I made earlier. It's kind of helpful to have some kind of guiding heuristic. It is very abstract, but it also kind of is a distilled way of looking at everything. And it's loose structure that really helps guide me. It's something that I find very useful. It especially when, like, developing new features, new concept, new ideas. It's like, these are the things I look for, like, in an idea, like, okay, I want to try this out. Does it have room to kind of, like, evolve? Is there room to kind of, like, grow the mechanics in game and all that? Let's look now beyond just joke writing and see how this is applied in the other parts of the game. So we're looking at world building, which is kind of sits into the narrative design in terms of game development, right? And a lot of how this was approached in building relationships, it's based on this, like, improv comedy technique where, let's say, if X is true, what else is true about this? So, we start with, like, okay, if in this world you play as buildings, right? All the human characters, quote unquote, are buildings. What else is true about this world? That means, like, it doesn't make sense for there to be, like, human portraits. Like, if you play other, like, dating sims, like bizarre dating sims, a lot of time you'll see, like, a human anime painting of what that bird looks like, for example. So it kind of leans in. We think of the human as our own being. So we really lean in, like, what else is true. We talk a little bit about interior gastronomy, what buildings eat, what they are as beings, and if we consider them as beings, what about other like equivalents of organisms, right? We looked at other animals also dwell in, like, different dwellings. So we expand on that. Like, there's a cat tree that shows up later on in the game. Kind of inspired by, like, the fact, like, you can, a lot of time, there's this Twitter account that's can you pet the dog? And so this is kind of made in response to that. There's, like, a dog house later on, a bird house that I haven't animated yet, so it's not in the slide. When we think about physicality, like, what if we move on to physicality? Like, what about philosophy? Like, and houses as beings, like, what would they think about? So I know, kind of a spoiler, but there's kind of like an architect, and it kind of acts as the, how do you call it, like, theology of these buildings. And there's lots of, when you build it in certain ways, lots of rooms or buildings to play with, like lots of room to play with in terms of narrative flow, like about like how buildings are usually built according to blueprints, like what does it mean to be designed a certain way and to defy that certain design, or to be built with a certain design in mind, like what is that, how does that affect a being psychologically? And so there's interesting things to explore there, and it helps new themes emerge over time. So yeah, if you think about it too much, I think fishing, it gets a little bit internally inconsistent, right? We talk about zoology and how that's represented through buildings as well, but not fish. But sometimes you get the one thing that doesn't make that much sense. You get away with certain things, but as long as you set limit for like what is the random XD, like haha, fish, their cars. So we'll talk a little bit about a little bit more behind the scene development, right? This is a beat sheet, so it's very zoomed out, and that's done on purpose because I don't want you to read in detail what is being in the beat sheet. But the idea is that something features a beat sheet, and the idea is that you start off with like, I have a rough plan of where the story wants to go, and you kind of build like, okay, you have done this assignment back in like school of like, where's the climax of the story, where's the resolution. That helps start out like, okay, I think I want this section to be like the dramatic moment, and I want this section to be the ending, and then you kind of fill things in over time, and this gives a good rough look at like, okay, this feels somewhat okay, and you actually make it, and then things change. So, but the point of the beat sheet is that like it gives you room for like setups and payoffs. So if you set something up early on, you can think about where that theme reemerges later on. There's a similar exercise with like more dramatic storytelling, right? You have foreshadowing, and when like a twist or something happens, it's making sure that those themes are like tackled all throughout the game or throughout the story. It's making sure that it's within the consciousness of the players or of the readers or the listeners and whatnot. Cool. And then when we talk about game design, a lot of times it's in the game it's kept very simple. So this is a tweet from a friend of mine, Marina. She talked about she's an emotional game designer, and here she talks about how the design of the game kind of has to be simple for an emotional moment, and that's because sometimes what people forget when you're talking about design is that a big part of game design is onboarding, is how easy it is for players to understand. So the more complex the gameplay is, the more work you have to do to set up those explanations. So the more you have to, like, okay, this interacts with this in this way, it evolves in this way. So sometimes with like a more emotional scene, it's hard to get into the emotions if you're also trying to understand the mechanics. So it's okay to have very like, oh, the gameplay is pressing A, if it's in service of something else. It's also something that you will see in other genres that's not just emotional, not just comedy, but also horror. If you look at like horror games, a lot of the gameplay is pretty simple. When you put it down on paper, it's like, oh, wait a minute, I just move around the corner and press A. But that's something you don't realize in the moment because of how the emotions of it set up. But if the gameplay is too complicated, then you kind of like get stuck trying to figure out the game and not in the mood of what it's conveying, right? Okay, so the next part of this talk, we'll be going through a lot of case studies. There'll be a lot of games, and I kind of realized that I play a lot of video games, a lot of indie games, and I don't know if these games that I'm going to bring up are things that people have played before. So we'll see. I'll try my best to explain, give good understanding of the game. But I just think like there's within comedy, there's lots of different places that people take them, and it's kind of useful to kind of see how different people like interpret like how it's applied in different games, basically. Okay, so first thing we'll talk about is, thank goodness you're here, One of After. It came out last year. It's this very British game. It's a funny slapstick comedy. It's really hard to explain what the game is about because it is so British. it is so much nonsense that I play through it and I still don't understand. But beneath all the wacky, silly adventure, there's some structure in there. So we'll talk a little bit about the structure itself. It's a linear story that's told across multiple areas. It's set in this town in the middle of nowhere in England. And there you play as this little salesman over here. There are different areas that you kind of go through. And as the story progresses, you'll go through the same areas over and over, but the day progresses, right? So the characters are in different areas as you keep going. So the characters, as you show up, they'll have new dialogue. You'll have kind of storyline will get progressed over and over. So that's kind of the gist of the game. There's chapters by chapter by chapter. You slap things around. You meet characters and they say funny things, and they say something new that's funny. And then something new that's funny. That's the game. Yeah. And except for one part. So there's this area in the game where you have to kind of backtrack back and forth to within the same chapter. So you keep having to go from the left of the screen to the right of the screen and back to the left. And there are these two neighbors that are arguing. Every single time that you walk by them, they say something different. And it's the only time in the game where the dialogue changes within the chapter. Usually the dialogue changes between chapters, right? And they're just arguing about, trash. Like two neighbors who, one of them put their trash inside the neighbor's bin. And something like, arguing with neighbors is something very universal. And it's just kind of funny as the bits, as it keeps going, it becomes something different. There's something else that keeps showing up. Eventually, just why'd you put me in the bin? And then they both are in the bin at some point, and they're playing cards together. This is something that within improv, there's rule of thirds, and there's also a rule of 19, where instead of just 3 or something, you go 19 or something, and you just keep going, in a way that's it's in the background. It's not too. If it doesn't land, it kind of stays in the background, right? You're not forced to sit through it, like you are in this talk. So let's talk about musical structures and how that helps with land. In this game, we'll talk about the ending of the game, and I kind of realized that it's very hard to hear the audio, but maybe I can play it on here.
Yeah, guys, fine. Come here instead and help me slice my crispy bread.
Spin my grinder round and round, don't stop until my meat is round.
So this part is it is nothing like the rest of the game. It comes at the end of the game where this part of the game, music writing at all, it plays with something called call and response, right? In writing melodies, a lot of times there will be a structure that kind of starts a conversation between instruments, and then not maybe another instrument or maybe a melody line that kind of answers that call. So it applies a similar structure, right? In music writing, sometimes you do a call, a response, another call, another response, and then a call, and the response is different because it's a key change to a different part of the song. So that is something that you can that's a pattern that is very recognizable in a way that people don't always realize. And it's something that when you recognize these patterns, it's something to play around with, right? So in this game, there's a lot of when things keep repeating over and over, but the screen changes. There's something to expect, what else is this? What else is going to be the next verse? It's asking you to do very random things. There's something very playful about rhythm. It's okay, how do you press a response in a way that matches the rhythm? There's something very innately fun about that. And there's also rhymes. Every single line that happens, it rhymes with the previous one and it rhymes with the next. So there's something, once you have that kind of structure, it gives you room for okay, how do you extend that, or how do you disrupt that, right? What about fake out rhymes and all that? So the next part I want to talk about is this game called What the Car. How many people are familiar with? But it is a game where you play as a car, and the car has legs, and then the car doesn't have legs sometimes. But it does this thing called physical comedy really well. I can't really explain what physical comedy is. It's just funny. it's just kind of fun to see things move in a funny way, and it's kind of like, I mean, like, look at the guy, you know. that's all I have to say. But the point I'm trying to make is that like each level, each area builds on the joke. The game is structured in like there's chapters, there's levels format to it, and each level it tries something different in terms of the physicality. There's one where you get a rocket, there's one where it's just long, and it gives room to kind of for players to expect, like, okay, this chapter is going to be something new, this chapter is going to be something new, or this chapter is going to evolve like what the base movement skill is. Well, there was also, we'll talk a lot about like games that you consider to be comedic, but there's also comedy plays a pretty like big role in like drama writing. So we're looking at how we blend comedy and drama. This game called In Stars and Time. It's an RPG Maker game. It's a time loop RPG, and I think it's a good game to look at in terms of like narrative design structure. The dev came from webcomics, like writing webcomics into making games, and it's like a good look at like, okay, how does that get translated into like an RPG from a comic book writing or like webtoon writing background. So yeah. Just kind of get better look at things. It's very dramatic stakes. The world is ending, and you have to save the world. The combat is all like, the characters are all crying. They're all very sad. The enemies are all very sad. And there's an exploration aspect to it, like puzzle solving. Lots of hallways. There's lots of enemies. Lots of puzzles. But at the bottom hall over here, there's a room, and in each room there's a dialogue section. Think of it as a cutscene. And most of the time, these cutscenes act as like a resting place to contrast the drama. So the rest of the game, you're doing combat, you're avoiding enemies, you're figuring out what to do. And then within these rooms, it's kind of like, okay, let's take a breather. And a lot of times, there's usually like a funny dialogue. Like the characters are all making fun of one character, so they're all like bullying the main character. Sometimes they're bullying Sifrin. In this case, just kind of said something funny. Like in a group chat when one of her friends like write a typo and then everyone makes fun of them. That is an equivalent going on here, and it helps contrast the dramatic moments with something funny. And when you have like, okay, whenever you see a new room, there's gonna be like a new situation, a new sitcom development. It helps create some kind of structure, and then you can play with that structure, right? So what happens if, let's say, there's 5 characters here, what happens if one of them goes missing? And how does that change the dynamic of like the new room you encounter? So when you have the structure of like, drama, comedy, drama, and then it gives room to like, okay, now what if I change that? What if something changes and it helps you go towards where you want the story to go? Pretty recent, called Wanderstop. I played this on my flight to GDC last month, and I was like, let me add that to the top. So here it is. Wanderstop takes a lot of notes from improv comedy, just kind of give a sense of what the game is. It's about brewing tea, but it's also about recognizing drama. It's very much, it kind of game is about therapy, but it's kind of hard to convince people to go to therapy based on personal experience. So instead, like, having comedy to kind of get in there to help like ease in the gameplay, to kind of get into the topics we want to talk about. So within the game, there's lots of different characters that show up. They're all customers at the tea shop, and they're very fantasy. One of them is this knight that shows up. Customers don't stay around for very long, so they have to establish, like, their character has to be established in a very succinct way. And it helps when you when you go to improv, for example, you have to set things up very quickly in the scene. Someone says a word and like, okay, how do I set the scene? How do I get everyone in the audience to understand what's going on? And how do I get even the other people doing improv to understand where I'm headed towards, right? So a lot of the writing, when you kind of read this, like the writing in this game, it really feels like it's comedy. So it's improv comedy. One of the things I mentioned earlier, the rule of 19. One of this, so when you talk to Gerald, he has pictures of him and his son, and he will like really want to see his picture, and he just keeps asking, "Oh, I have another picture. I have another picture. I have another picture. I have another picture." It's kind of like what I mentioned earlier with the rule of 19. There's lots of things going on here. It's something you don't expect, right? It's a very like this writing dialogue is kind of like set up in a very like, visual novel kind of style in terms of how it looks, how things are conveyed in terms of like the programming systems of it all. Except for this one part, it just changes and shows images over and over. So in terms of like the programming production side, it's not a lot of work. In terms of the impact, it's something that's unique, something that's like it's something that doesn't feel like I've seen it before, and it's something that only matches this character and really helps land this character's like sensibility of just like I have a bunch of pictures of my child and he doesn't really understand his dynamic with his child. His child kind of hates him, but he's really happy about it. Good for him. So yeah, so. The other part of the game is with the choices over here. You get the character in the game feels very much like the straight man in the scene. Because Alta is kind of like emotionally stunted. It matches it makes sense that she plays as a straight man in the comedy scene. And straight man is kind of the person who's just like normal. Everyone else is wacky and wild. If you play this game, like especially the business people in the game, my favorite people to play it. It's lots of fun. But anyways, the dialogue over here kind of, when you play a straight man, there's lots of different ways to go, right? Like very sarcastic straight man, lots of very sincere straight man, and there's kind of like options is one of the things you can kind of play around with. But yeah, so we'll talk about lots of games today. But please take note that none of the games have featured puns. And that's because puns are not funny. And it's sorry, they are playful, but they are not inherently humorous. And that's a hill that I will die on. That thank you. And why is that? Because puns are exhausting. They're painfully obvious. They're always like, how many times have you heard like egg slam, wow, this egg dish, whatever, who cares? But sometimes puns can be funny, but you have to work for it. It is not automatically funny. So to kind of in service of that, we'll talk about this game. It's called Knuckle Sandwich. Maybe people have played it, but it's like WarioWare meets Earthbound, made by an Australian dev. And it really, the game is absurd. And it's ridiculous and sensible, and I'll just kind of go through the intro beat. So kind of sit tight, strap, get ready. There's lots of things that will happen as I show kind of what happens and kind of detail what happens in the scene. So like any good RPG, you start off waiting for a bus. It's driving you to this place called the job center. You meet a bunch of NPCs along the way, like this dog. There's this old man who's kind of like a reference to Pokemon. Okay, now you're in the center, right? You had to fill in some forms. This one's asking you like video games. Now it's a game show portion, right? Which is a natural way to get to interview for a job. The wheels lands on Dancer, and you try out this job out in a minigame. Well, that didn't work out because the minigame gets too hard. So you're back on stage. The next job that lands is Space Cleaner job, and it's a shoot 'em up minigame. And the minigame gets too hard, and you don't land that job either. The next minigame job is this Bug Keeper, and it introduces you to combat in the game, the WarioWare aspect. And surprise, you fail that. You also fail that. You end up getting a minimum wage job at this burger shop. There's another minigame as you work, right? You serve burgers. It also gets really hard. Okay, shift is over. Nighttime. Gotta pick up the trash. Surprise, lightning flashes. The dude's trying to move. Oh, did you see it? You can barely see it. But that dude shows up and is trying to mug you. And it's a boss fight. You have to fight him. And you can't see him, but he's dead. And the boss is like, what have you done? So, you got to clean up. There's only one way to get rid of the corpse. So you serve the corpse in the burger, and that's where you get to the pun, which is Knuckle Sandwich, because you killed the guy and he's now in the sandwich. But it kind of goes like, it's something, the where it kind of goes, like as you play the game, like me explaining the game is very different from you experiencing the game, right? Because it just is absurd all the way through, and it doesn't stop here. It keeps going places. But that's I can't keep standing here and explain the game. So last bit of case study, which is I gotta plug my own game. We'll be looking through kind of like my approach to a lot of the scenes was just pairing real life scenarios with like ridiculous happenstance. So this is a scene that happens at some point in the game, and it's a little bit spicy, put it lightly. But yeah, I'll just kind of play it and we'll go through it together. Right. Yeah. So, the scene, it's when we talked about like furniture, we talked about buildings, a big part of when you put that two together, it's like moving in, moving out, moving things in and out of like places. And so it just kind of made sense, we're at a picnic, we build furniture together. This is kind of naturally where it goes. A lot of like visual novel dating sims, they have a very like, weird scene where you like feed the player, if the player like kind of feeds your date, right? And that's a very weird scene, and I kind of want to play with that in a way that's like a little bit more sensible, a little bit more grounded. So let's keep moving on. And let's just play video. Move on, but the point I really want to make clear here is this line over here. I think it's one where like the dot over here is like, what is this character going to say? And once that it gets landed, the whole scenery changes. There's a lot going in to make sure like, hey, I'm switching up the context. Whatever you thought this game is so far, actually it's about something entirely different. And I think like for me it was when I wrote this line, I was like, okay, I figured it out. And let's keep moving. This happens later on. Yeah. So the music, you probably heard it's a bit of a jazz. So I thought the only thing that made sense is to add a little scatting. It doesn't really like scatting at the moment because I don't know how to do that. So that's something for me to fix. But it plays with the music, the theme that's going on. Shout out to Gina, who is a composer who kind of nailed the vibe of the scene. There's a lot of a lot of input that happens in the music that plays according to input to kind of help make sure everything builds up in the same way. But yeah, enough about that. Well, no more of that scene. You have to buy the game to see where it goes. So let's talk about closing thoughts. Approaching comedy, this talk is about comedy, but it really feels like a lot more than comedy. A lot of the structure that I'm talking about, that I've given examples for, is something that is not specific to comedy. It really parallels things like I mentioned for drama and horror in a way that you play a lot with expectations in the same way. If you look at like a new game that came out, post-trauma, Raw for you published it. A lot of it is fixed camera, like PS2 fixed camera era, and you play with expectations in different ways. You're like, oh, this camera is fixed, but it moves towards the screen as the player moves. Right? There's lots of room to play around with that. Oh, this camera isn't fixed. Like, what happens over here? So, like with horror, you play with patterns as well. And what I really want to kind of get across at this point is that not necessarily like, here is my explanation of what comedy is, but here is a loose framework. And the takeaway isn't like, let me apply this framework, but more to like encourage you guys to think about your own process. This is how I quantify like my instincts, like things that I've made so far. I'm like, oh, people find this funny. Let me figure out how I made it. How did I come up with this? And what made sense to my brain? What didn't make sense? And how I figure out which direction to go. It's something that I encourage everyone to kind of like, if you do something creatively, it's to think about your own creative process and to kind of figure out your own heuristics, because it really helps when you work on a new scene. It's like, okay, how do I make sure this is funny? How do I make sure jokes land? And for me, it's if I can play with the patterns, if there's something going on here that I can play around with, I have some amount of confidence where it's like, if a joke doesn't land, something else will land, you know? And I just want to talk a little bit about like where kind of this all came from, right? Because earlier on, I in the slides very clear, I don't have like writing experience. I don't have comedy experience. I read this book. I think it was really helpful. There's only one page. The book doesn't really teach you how to write because it's impossible to teach you how to write. But it does put a lot of emphasis on grit and on introspection, because there is kind of no one way to teach you how to write. Writing is very, like, it's a craft. You have to understand how your brain works, how your creativity is affected by your like well-being and everything and anything in between. The book only had like a page about like comedy, and it was just like, or 2 pages, and it was like, comedy, a lot of games try comedy and it's not good. And that was kind of like, don't just reference memes. And that the book was just saying like, don't just reference memes and just, you know, think about comedy fundamentals, think about setups and payoffs. And that is basically the structure for this talk, and how I came up with this talk was from this book. Last thing I want to talk about, well, second last thing, is, you know, how do you find inspiration from comedy? For me, a lot of it kind of comes from Dropout, which is like a show with ex-college humor people. It's very like, there's lots of very talented improv comedians and it's featured on lots of different game shows. For example, there's a tabletop RPG game, like D&D live play, or just a group of comedians are just playing D&D together. It's a lot shorter than Critical Role, which is why I watched this, not Critical Role. And one of the seasons is kind of Candy. The concept is like Candyland, which is a children's board game, meets Game of Thrones, which is high lethal drama. And the way they develop that character, there's like, how did they develop towards a central premise? There's like a joke later on in the game that's very tied to the world building. And the approach of it is very like, okay, if X is true, what else is true about that universe? And a lot of it, the way I approach building relationships is very, very parallel to how the world was developed in the show. Last question is one thing I get a lot. And how do you find humor? Like, how do you like translate humor across cultural barriers? Something question I get a lot, and I just want to get ahead of Q&A by saying that, I don't know. I do not have the answer, but I think being a freak is universal. Cool. That's the top. Thank you, everyone. There's a QR code that shows the game. Blue Sky, games are open there, and on Instagram as well. You can chat, message, or ask follow-up questions, whatnot.
Okay, so now we will proceed with Q&A session. So if you guys have any question, you guys can just raise your hand.
Hello. I'd like to ask, do you playtest the jokes in your games? Or if not, yeah.
I do. They don't stay funny. I think like it's funny sometimes it's not funny. A lot of it is like, okay, am I just exhausted, or am I just tired because I keep running the same thought over and over and over. There's a lot of questions. Like it's hard to, I do play test them. I forget that the game is funny most of the time. Like when I show the game, I forgot that like puns are funny, and I was supposed to like stop and then people laugh at the puns. But yeah, I do play tests, but you know, figuring out if it's funny or not funny, it's something that like is hard. But I have friends that sometimes I send it to, like the scene with the table moving scene. I have a friend, I sent it to my composer I'm working with to see like, is this good? Is this too much? And she was like, I think you could go more. so yeah, I have some friends I send it to, play testers, but a lot of time it's me first.
thanks for the talk. Even better than the GDC.
Oh, thank you, thank you.
I think I asked a similar question then, but it was just more around like, I guess like localization, because I know you're planning to have your game in different languages. Is there a concern if the comedy doesn't land in another language besides English?
Yeah, this is a similar question I had at GDC, but I had a bad answer then. I had a better answer now because I had a whole month to think about how I could have answered things differently. But the question about like localization and comedy, I think like pun, for example, is something that's inherently hard to translate, right? Because a lot of the setup is based off of the language itself. Same thing with certain jokes are a bit more cultural, right? It is based off of cultural norms. So I think like a lot of the comedy in the game like is cross-cultural. I think it helped that I grew up in Thailand, I lived in the US, so that like having experienced jokes that didn't land across cultural barriers, it helped giving me a good like look into things in terms of like within the game, car fishing up a fish. It's something that doesn't make sense in any language, and so if there's room for that joke to evolve, if there are references that make sense to most players, right? It's an indie game. It's not going to go to that many players. If it makes sense to the general audience, like the freakiness of it all, like that part is like cross-cultural, right? So there are things that like the puns will not all land, and that's okay. Some jokes will not land, but as long as you don't put that joke as like if it's a central like punchline, then you kind of set yourself up for failure in localization. But the game is like, for example, a lot of puns are in the journal. So if you go and look at the description of the fish, there are puns there, the name of the fish, and they don't have to be puns if they don't work. That's okay. But if they are puns, it's also okay. That way, like if it fails, it doesn't destroy your game.
Thank you.
Hello. Okay. Thank you so much for the sharing. I think it's very nice. But so, how do you reference your general jokes and comedy in general? Because do you think of it by yourself, or there is a reference to the set joke or something like that?
A lot of them, they're like sometimes there are things like like a joke that's taken a certain direction that I like, and I have to figure out how to translate it, right? That's kind of like you copy someone's joke, which I do sometimes, but it's figuring out how to translate it in the context of the game, right? Context of being buildings and all that. I reference things every now and then, but usually it's not about the reference that is the main punchline. Like, I don't think there are like there isn't a lot of pop culture references, and if there are, it's not like the punchline. It might be a throwaway line. Like if someone doesn't get it, they don't realize it was a joke they didn't get. I think that if that's the like main punchline, and then they're like, oh, I didn't get it, then like you immediately shift the mood to be like, oh, I'm disappointed. This game isn't funny. When there are like references, it's kind of hidden in a way that like the girls who get it, the girls who don't get it, they don't realize they don't get it. But no, references is not something. It's not my main thing. A lot of it is like a way of thinking. Like, okay, if X is true, what else should be true? Like, ooh, it would be funny to kind of play around with like about dating culture in general, right? Like one night stand of it all. Like, what happens in that situation? How that works for a building? What are the puns, right? But yeah.
Hi, lovely game. I love it still. I just want to ask, I think comedy is subjective, right? So when, let's say through the development, how do you find that balance? Like, do you go like, maybe have, let's say 10 people you play test with and only 6 of them say it's funny and the other 4 is like, screw you, I think it's funny. Or do you, in the end, decide, oh, screw you, I'm a freak, I think it's funny, so I'll just go with it.
I think like there's another talk at UDC by the Thank Goodness UK developers, right? And they asked like, there's a question that's similar to what you asked, and they was like, oh, they weren't trying to make a funny game. And I think that's like something like, a comedy game is it's funny and that helps with the marketing side of things, but isn't necessarily like the goal of the game, right? If the game isn't funny, I think like there's still other parts of it, like the ridiculousness of it all, still says something. Like, but humor is subjective, and it's definitely not the goal isn't like do they laugh or they don't laugh. It's like, are they engaged? You know, does it make sense? Is it grounded enough? Is there room to kind of like, do they get it? You know, and also like the other thing is that like most people will not get it, and that's okay, right? It's an indie game. Indie games are so niche. We forget how niche indie games are and how very like little amount of people play video games. And I think that like it's something to worry about if you have an audience, and I have no audience when I make this game. So it did make sense to kind of like, oh, are people gonna get it? Just try it out. And I found out that people got it. I was like, okay, I guess there's something there.
Hi, thanks for the talk. I was just wondering, at what point do you workshop your jokes? Because it seems like a lot of the comedy is relying on like the situations, the animations, you know, the pacings of the scene. So, do you work off of like a storyboard, or are you workshopping a script, or like at what point would you push it out to someone to just see if it works?
So I work alone for most of the game. I work with the composer and like localization team. When do I workshop it? Good question. So when I first I write the script in the like, let's say a different thing, I try to figure out like, okay, when I read through it, does it make sense? Like how try to like envision what it looks like in game. And then there's the next step of like putting it in game, and you kind of see it in a whole different light. And that's kind of like me workshopping it on my own. It's kind of like if you record like a delivery version of it and see how it lands on video versus on writing. And that's like two different steps, right? And then later on, like a few days later, I come and see. Sometimes it's like chat, like the demo's been out, right? And it's part of like been helpful for me to see like what lands, what doesn't land. A lot for me, I don't really workshop with other people, and I don't know if that is a good thing or a bad thing. It certainly makes things more individual, right? But if they don't land, they don't land. So I don't know. I should workshop more, I guess, but I don't really do it. Sometimes I see it in people play it on Twitch demo, and it's not funny, and I'm just like, I don't have time to fix this, and that's okay.